Let's take a look back at the unit on the Federal Republic of Mexico. The Mexican Revolution, sparked in 1910, was in large part due to economic inequalities and fear of foreigners taking over the state's industries. In 1917, the current Mexican Constitution was drafted and adopted with several of the following provisions, including universal health care and education for all Mexican people, guaranteed Social Security, reform in agriculture, labor laws that protected workers, and soil rights that limited the influence of foreigners. Looking to bring together Mexicans from all walks of life, the first dominant political party of Mexico was established following the revolution, that of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI. It became the dominant party shortly after the adoption of the Constitution and maintained its dominance well into the 1980s and 1990s. It worked because it brought together coalitions from all different types of political groups through a policy known as clientelism. Clientelism was the awarding of land, protection, or government jobs strictly for political loyalty. The result of this was an extremely large bureaucracy that became very corrupt and inept over the course of many decades. To keep peace and maintain control throughout the country, the Institutional Revolutionary Party embraced a corporatist system that allowed for many interest groups to have direct influence over the types of policies that the PRI adopted to. Since so many groups had access, there was few challenges to the PRI's control in the decades leading up to the 1990s. The PRI won elections easily and faced no legitimate competition. The long-term result was a government with high corruption and a government that was far more responsive to the interest groups involved and less responsive to the people. Mexico has a long-founded tradition in Roman Catholicism, and the PRI saw this as an immediate threat to its ability to control the nation. Thus, the PRI adopted many policies that were known as anti-clerical. Anti-clericalism is the opposition of power by churches and clergy in the political process. Some of the policies that the PRI adopted in its anti-clerical views included a secular education in which the government wrote the curriculum for all public schools, property owning restrictions being placed on churches, particularly those of Catholic faith, prohibiting suffrage rights to Catholic priests, and prohibiting public worship outside of any church. To maintain its political control as well as keep its constitutional promise to block foreign government involvement, the PRI implemented a policy known as import substitution industrialization in the 1940s that spanned several decades. The goal of this policy was to produce as much as possible within Mexico's borders and blocking foreign involvement in their economic growth. To do this, many enterprises were brought under the control of the state. There were some very profound positive effects of this policy, but over the long haul, it stifled many opportunities for growth in the Mexican economy. Of its positive effects, the increase in Mexican GDP and GNP was astronomical, especially in the early years of the policy. The result of this was increased literacy rates and a drop in infant mortality rate. Industrialization and urbanization picked up massively in the decades of import substitution. However, over the long haul, income gaps between the wealthiest and poorest Mexicans grew at massive rates, particularly between northern and southern Mexicans. This decreased worker efficiency and motivation, and the value and quality of goods and services diminished because of lack of competition. Economic growth began to slow and eventually stop by the late 1980s, creating a large informal sector of workers who left the actual marketplace to take jobs that did not guarantee them benefits or establish working contracts. With its economy completely stagnant by the early 1990s, the Mexican state entered into a trade agreement with its North American neighbors, the United States and Canada, in 1994, known as the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. The goal of this policy was to gradually reduce and eventually eliminate tariffs between these three trading countries. There was mixed reaction within the Mexican people about the entrance of this agreement, with particularly rural residents in southern Mexico being outraged, believing that Mexico would not be able to compete with the goods produced in the United States. Starting later on that year, an army of national liberators known as the Zapatistas began a cause for revolution within the Mexican states. Based out of the southernmost state of Chiapas, this group tried to incite a new revolution and used violent tactics to try to gain control of the state. Though their tactics did fail, their message was heard loud and clear by the state. They have tried in recent years, however, to use more legitimate means of gaining political access. The Zapatistas in modern Mexico do not use the type of violent tactics shown in the early 1990s, but now use the internet as a way of trying to peacefully lobby Mexican leaders to exit out of the free trade agreement. Now, over 2 decades since its adoption, the effects of the North American Free Trade Agreement have become pretty clear for its 3 member nations, and at this point it's safe to say that the results have been mixed. For the Mexican states, there have been some very clear positives, but also some pretty definitive negatives. On the positive side, there had been increased labor for the northern states of Mexico with the establishment of maquiladoras, manufacturing factories that have set up shop all over the U.S.-Mexican border. Also, there's been a larger export market for Mexican petroleum, as over 80% of Mexican petroleum is exported to the U.S. On the negative side, however, the poverty gap between northern and southern Mexicans has reached astronomical levels. Mexico failed to invest in the proper infrastructure that was needed to compete. Also, the trade imbalance has left many parts of the country in deep poverty. Mexico is a country that has been slowly liberalizing its economy in the last few decades by selling off some of its parastatals to foreign investors. By parastatal, we mean a government-owned corporation or agency. At this point in Mexico, the largest owned parastatal is still Pemex, the country's nationally owned petroleum industry, which is extremely large. In fact, it has a national asset worth of over $400 billion US, making it the second largest non-publicly listed company in the world. Taxes on Pemex revenue provide about a third of the tax revenue that the country takes in. There is some reluctance on the part of some legislators to open up Pemex to foreign investment. However, those who believe that they should argue that the country currently does not have the equipment and technology needed to explore new reserves. Part of the reason the PRI does not dominate Mexican politics in the way that it once did is that elections have become more competitive. In the 1990s, the Federal Electoral Institute was established. This was supposed to be an independent commission that oversaw all Mexican elections, ensuring opportunities for suffrage rights for all Mexican people. It also put in more equitable financial contribution rules and a more balanced media access process. President Enrique Nieto, who was elected in 2012, cited budget deficiencies as a reason why the agency needed to be reformed, and shut it down in its current format in 2014, replacing it with the National Electoral Institute. Some of his critics have argued that this is another example of the PRI trying to overstretch its boundaries to take back a dominant figure. With the economy crumbling and elections becoming more competitive in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the National Action Party emerged as the biggest challenge to the PRI. It started by winning several gubernatorial elections in some northern Mexican states. The plan's platform includes more regional power, along with the rejection of the anti-clerical policies of the PRI. They also believe in opening and liberalizing the economy more with less government regulations and control, and reducing corporate presence in government by creating more balanced and fair elections. In 2000, the PAN made history by electing the first non-PRI president, Vicente Fox. However, President Fox found it very difficult to get his policy-making process through, as he was met with resistance by a legislature that was still controlled by the PRI. In the mid-1990s, Mexico became officially a multi-party system with the emergence of the Party of the Democratic Revolution, a party that stood up for the rights of urban residents, particularly those in Mexico City, and for younger Mexican voters. The platform of the PRD was to create more equitable economic opportunities, attack corporations and government corruption, and to stronger the environmental policies that were creating mass pollution in the inner cities. The PRD, however, whilst doing well in regional elections and some municipal elections, is still struggling to compete on a national level. In large part, this is because of the poorly defined platform and divisions that exist within the party between more radical and pragmatic members. Understanding the voting behaviors of the Mexican people is not that unique from other countries throughout the world. Education remains the greatest predictor of how involved someone will be politically. In the northern Mexican states, the National Action Party tends to do very well, where people have greater access to education and jobs, and thus they're more inclined to challenge the status quo. However, the traditional PRI still does very well in rural areas and where there are older Mexican voters. The PRD, which with its fragmented base, still does its best work in urban areas, particularly in Mexico City, where there's a large percentage of the country's youth. With the PRI's control in decline, Mexico is finally starting to realize its true federal system that the Constitution created, as power has become slightly more decentralized and devolved over the course of time. Governors and state legislatures are beginning to take on more of the power and responsibility that they were intended to have in the federal system, although there are still a few places in which they're reluctant to do so. Open elections to elect state and local leaders, including governors, has signified a more democratic country. Historically, the presidents used to handpick the governors of all 31 states to ensure central control by the PRI. In Mexico, by far, the president is the central figure when it comes to enacting and enforcing policy, as he serves as both the head of state and head of government. It is important to know that the President of Mexico is elected to a single 6-year term that is non-renewable in accordance with the policy of sexenio. Sexenio is the constitutional process that limits the president in Mexico to only one 6-year term. This is done to try to curb some of his executive power. The policy has, however, met with mixed results, as some believe that it does not allow a president to create more long-term based policies. State governors are also bound to this term. The president oversees one of the world's largest bureaucracies with over 1.5 million employees. Current President Enrique Peña Nieto was elected in 2012, signaling a return to power for the PRI amid accusations of some electoral fraud. The Mexican president's powers are robust, and they include initiating and enforcing policy, making some policy through executive decree, which is the U.S. equivalent of an executive order, serving as the commander-in-chief of the military, signing treaties with other foreign leaders, and appointing officials and federal judges, amongst his several other powers. The Mexican legislature has a history of being a rubber-stamp body that has simply bowed down to the authority of the president. However, as elections have become more competitive and more transparent, it is becoming a larger player to balance out the executive in the political process. The Mexican legislature is bicameral, meaning it has two houses, the lower house being the Chamber of Deputies, all elected to 3-year terms, while the upper house is also called the Senate, with 6-year terms in place. Members are elected by a combination system that includes both first-past-the-post voting and proportional representation. Some of the powers of the legislature include passing laws, approving budgets, approving treaties signed by the president, and creating constitutional amendments. The Mexican legal system is similar to the U.S. in several ways, however, one separates it very clearly. In the U.S., the common law system heavily relies on precedents in making decisions, while the civil law system in Mexico relies more on some colonial laws and cultural traditions. Judicial review is permitted in the Mexican system, but it does not have the effect of nationalizing law as it does in the United States. Also, in Mexico, there is no such thing as punitive damages or tort law, which means there are far less lawsuits in Mexico than there are in the United States. Taking a look at the people of Mexico today, over 90% of the Mexican population is considered mestizo, meaning they have European and Amerindian descent, or they belong to one of several indigenous groups. The dominant language is, of course, Spanish. Roman Catholicism does play a large role today, even in spite of anti-clerical policies that were put in place by the PRI for several decades. Cultural diffusion through open trade agreements between the United States and Mexico has created a little bit of a shift in national identity, as many parts of American culture have made its way into Mexican culture. The Mexican people have a strong sense of nationalistic pride and are very proud of their heritage. While Mexico is certainly a transitional democracy that's trying to escape a very deep corporatist past, it is not in danger of becoming a failed state due to high levels of legitimacy and a strongly accepted constitution. The people of Mexico have continued to enjoy a very strong civil society, voicing their opinions through a variety of groups. This was in place even during the tight control of the PRI. There are, of course, several challenges facing Mexico as they move forward in the 21st century, the first of which is their relationship with their neighbors to the north, the United States. Immigration policies have become very controversial, especially in the wake of the attacks on 9/11/2001. The destruction of the environment, particularly in cities, including the capital city of Mexico City, has become a very big issue, as Mexico City has become one of the most polluted cities in the world. The mass poverty that has spread, especially in the southern part of the country, and the lack of equal access to education and housing is also a major issue. Amongst other issues include more competitive elections, drug trafficking, the power of cartels, the government corruption that exists, including within the police force, and transitioning from a corporatist system to that more of a pluralistic and democratic system. The balance of power between the national level and subnational levels also continues to be an issue for Mexico moving forward.